Figueroa, librarian for Inclusive Excellence with the UNC Chapel Hill University Libraries, and chair of the library's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Council. On behalf of University Librarian Elaine Westbrooks and UNC Press's Spangler Family Director John Shear, welcome to this afternoon's presentation of Dr. Warren Milner Jr. and his book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. Thank you so much for joining us for our second event in this year's virtual series, Off the Shelf, which is a co-production of the libraries and UNC Press to present new works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and our world. Over the next hour, Matt Torrey will be in conversation with Dr. Milner about his book. Before we begin, please note that the Q&A box is open for your questions, which we'll have time to moderate towards the end of the hour together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Matt Torrey, host for this afternoon's conversation. Matt is the Manuscripts, Research, and Instruction Librarian in Wilson Special Collections Library. Prior to coming to Carolina, he worked for the North Carolina State Historical Records Advisory Board. His scholarly interests focus on the research and instructional use of manuscript and archival materials. Matt holds an MSLS from UNC's UNC Chapel Hill's School of Information and Library Science. Thank you, Matt, so much for hosting our off-the-shelf conversation.
Thank you, Monica. I really appreciate being asked to talk to Warren today. So I'd like to introduce you all to Warren Milner. And if you'll forgive me, I'm actually going to read his short bio so that I get everything right. So Warren Milner is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He received his PhD from UNC Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include two academic books, the one that we'll be talking about today, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, and North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, that was put out by LSU Press in 2020. He's also published something that I've become aware of, the independently published Hertford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants in 2016. And he's published several articles in the Journal of Social History and in the North Carolina Historical Review. Warren received the Historical Society of North Carolina's R.D.W. Connor Award in 2014 and 2016 for the best journal article in the North Carolina Historical Review. And I can attest to the deep value that those articles have had. One of the things that's so really nice about being asked to read Warren's book is I actually get to read a book in its entirety, which is not something that I typically do. It was also a chance to read a book in a way that I often don't. I read almost all historical work product as a bibliography. And I've already recommended Warren's recent books in Beyond Slavery's Shadow to a graduate student who's coming up here. And in the past, I've recommended a number of the articles that he's written, especially the article on the Great Dismal Swamp. So Warren, welcome. This is, again, a great delight. And I would like to thank my colleagues, Monica and Katie, for really hosting this event, and our friends at the press for making this possible. I think that we need to begin with what is in many ways a very basic question, but which, as your book sort of demonstrates, is a very hard question. Who are free people of color, and how should we think about them? And more importantly, how shouldn't we think about them?
First of all, thanks, Matt, for hosting and asking questions today. And thanks to everybody else at the library who's played a part in this. And thanks to the folks at UNC Press as well. So as far as free people of color, who are we talking about? How should we think about them? Free people of color were people who were free during the period of slavery. And in this case, we're talking about the U.S. South or its colonial predecessors. And so those free people of color could be people of African and or Native American descent. Also cite a few examples of people who have ancestry in Asia, South Asia, But primarily we're talking about people of African descent and or Native American descent in the South who were free during this period of slavery. And so I think often what happens when we talk about free people of color, some people get confused by that terminology, or they come in with assumptions about that terminology. And usually the assumption is that we're talking about people of African descent when we're talking about free people of color. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that, you know, either the majority or a plurality of the free people of color were indeed people of African descent. However, that is not solely the case. And so that's why I use the term free people of color to be more inclusive. And also that's the term that was most often used, especially in the 19th century, as far as the sources that I was able to look at show. So that's really what I'm trying, the group of people I'm trying to talk about in this book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, and to put into a historical context.
When, one of the things that was really lovely about your book is the way that we all know that lived experience is very complicated. And it's often hard. We use shorthands that sort of really hide an awful lot of meaning. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was the way that you talked about legal systems, plural, across the South, to sort of pull at the differences that emerged over time and who might fall into this category. I I don't think that I had really read before much about Spanish law or French law. Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the various systems of law that would help define this category, understanding that, of course, systems of law change over time, and we'll talk about that change.
Right. Yeah. So throughout the book, of course, I'm covering a long time span. So I'm looking at the what I call the colonial period, which is actually multiple colonial periods in a certain way, because I'm looking at um, the British colonies, but also looking at Spanish colonies and French colonies that are part of the South. So for those people who aren't familiar, Louisiana and what would have been considered Louisiana would have gone much further north than modern day Louisiana, um, was at one time a French colony and then later a Spanish colony. And then it goes back to being a French colony before becoming part of the United States. And then also Florida was a Spanish colony, actually longer than it's been part of the United States. So in recognizing that, I'm trying to strike this balance at the beginning of the book about discussing the legal status of free people of color. So I'm having to look at multiple colonies in the British setting, but also these colonies that are primarily controlled by the Spanish and French. And as time goes on, and these colonies eventually become part of the United States, we still have this variation in the status and position of free people of color throughout the South, because the laws that dictate the rights of free people of color or dictate restrictions on free people of color are primarily made at the state and local level or the territorial level in certain context. And so as a result, from the late 1700s going into the mid 19th century, the status of free people of color is not exactly the same in every single locality. But generally, as time goes forward, those states or territories that don't have restrictions or as strict of restrictions as, say, Virginia, which is often the colony and later state that leads in imposing restrictions on the lives of free people of color. Those states that follow behind often eventually model their legislation to limit the rights of free people of color based on laws passed in Virginia. And I should add that the influence of a state like Virginia and its lawmakers isn't necessarily limited to the South, and we see forms of discrimination pop up in the laws of other states beyond the South. So in Pennsylvania, New York, etc., there are also discriminatory laws in those states. And later, in what becomes what we would consider the Midwest, depending on the time period, they might just consider it West. So places like Ohio, Illinois, Indiana also have these discriminatory laws.
I guess I don't want to leave the impression. Certainly, a large part of your argument focuses on statutes and the creation of laws that I think we can say increasingly erode, they seem to, I mean, generally erode the liberties and freedoms of free people of color during the period that we're talking about. But I think you argue persuasively that looking at legislation and reading it as reality is deeply problematic. And a large part of your work, and I suspect that we can talk a little bit more about the origins of your work, is to recapture, to I guess, excavate the lived experience of people who would have had to operate within these various sort of legislative and regulatory schemes that are constructed. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you actually went about making these laws real, at least looking at the impact that these laws had in a real sense.
Right. Yeah. So I definitely spent quite a bit of time trying to put some context around the discriminatory laws that pop up in the South over time. So, I mean, just to give an example for people who aren't familiar with this, there are several different restrictions passed on the lives of free people of color. Some of them are explicitly targeted at free people of color as a class. Sometimes they only deal with a certain segment of free people of color. But there are restrictions requiring or preventing that are supposed to prevent free people of color from traveling over state lines. So immigration restrictions, basically, and that's being done at the state level. There are restrictions on being able to either carry guns and other types of weapons, or licensing laws. So you need a license in order to carry a gun, for instance. Some states have restrictions on trade. So free people of color are prevented, especially when we're talking about the 19th century in certain areas, from being able to sell liquor. So the liquor trade is something, the legal liquor trade is something that only white people are allowed to engage in. So that's just a sampling of the different laws that are out there. But what I see is that in practice, these laws are not enforced in an even way. And often in some jurisdictions, maybe not enforced at all, or maybe enforced on one individual in the whole entire time period in which they're on the books. So for instance, the gun laws that restrict free people of color from carrying guns, it seems that in certain places, those laws are being selectively enforced. So individuals who are carrying guns either are not supposed to or carrying them without a license will be charged in the courts. But there are also instances where you clearly see that some free people of color are carrying guns without regularly registering their guns, or in places where they're not supposed to have guns at all. And I think for that particular example, part of the problem that we see is that some of these laws don't come with serious enforcement mechanisms. So, I mean, if you are in a society where people have guns and then you say they're not legal anymore, how are you going to go and confiscate those guns? Or in one instance that I spent a bit of time on in the book, there's a community where the gunsmith in the community is a free man of color. And so if he's not allowed to keep guns, the whole community is going to have a problem, because every time they have a gun problem, their gun falls apart. They need a new piece for their gun. That gun can't be repaired if that free man of color is not allowed to carry and hold guns. So they actually protest and, asked for exemption for him so that he can continue on during his trade, continue on with his trade. And it does seem, even after the state of Virginia prohibits free people of color from carrying guns, he's still in business fixing guns, because what are the people in the community going to do without him? They're in a rural community. They need guns to hunt. Primarily, that's the issue. And so the laws are ignored. And there are other instances that I discuss in the books. There are laws that require free people of color to register with county officials. And I think many people have observed, and I also observed, that these laws are not evenly enforced in different places. Some places have a more strict regime when it comes to requiring registration and making sure that free people of color carry papers showing that they're registered, while other places, it seems that free people of color are using these registration laws more as a way to have identification to show that they're free. So when they decide they're going to leave their home community, they'll go to the courthouse then and get registered, but not before, because in their local community, everybody knows who's free and who's not. Whereas if they're going to go outside of the county or go to another state, they need those documents as protection for their freedom as they're traveling. So in that example, you can see that, yeah, there's definitely a system that is oppressive and doesn't treat free people of color in the same way that many white people are treated. But at the same time, the states and localities below the states find it very difficult to develop a regime to uphold all of the different laws that they pass or are supposed to enforce against free people of color, which I think says something about the people who make those laws in the first place, because some of this stuff is probably predictable, that, yeah, you're going to pass this law, but how is it going to be enforced? I think that's a question that is usually asked in the process of making legislation, at least by people who are thinking. And so, yeah, they're unable to come up with answers for that, or maybe they're not actually particularly interested, especially if you're thinking about like a state border patrol to enforce laws preventing, they're supposed to prevent people from going back and forth across state borders. That would be extremely tricky and costly for states to uphold. Whereas a similar law that was supposed to prevent free people of color who were working on ships from coming on board or coming off board onto the land of a state where they weren't citizens or were not residents. Those laws may have been enforced a little bit more strictly because it's easier to do. A ship's coming into port, it's very easy to keep people that you don't want on land, off land, and to either, and if they do come on land, the law required for them to be jailed. So free people of color who are working on ships are often jailed in southern ports. It's not hard for that to happen. There are a limited number of ports for them to go to, so it's easier.
One of the, I guess it's a theme that sort of comes across your book is, well, you alluded to it when you talked about the registration process and the fact that it also creates a legally valid form of documentation that clearly indicates to all others the free status of the people that registered. I'm wondering if you can talk about other instances in which sort of a creative use of repressive systems, the court system, was used to the benefit free people of color were operating in a really interesting level with a lot of these systems that were meant not to serve their needs at all.
Right. I think the example that probably comes to mind, or does come to mind for me, is the laws that most Southern localities passed in the colonial period, restricting free people of color from testifying against white people in court. So you would think in a system in which free people of color can't testify that they're going to have a really difficult time winning court cases against white people, which in certain cases is true. They do struggle in certain instances. But at the same time, we do see free people of color going to court, suing white people and winning, even though they can't testify. So exactly how that worked, in some cases, we don't really know how they were able to get around the system. But it's in other instances, it's pretty clear that they're able to use their attorneys, use white witnesses who support their cases against the white people they're trying to sue. So yeah, they're able to, in a certain way, flip the system to their favor. Maybe the way that we see this most prominently is in freedom suits. So there are free people of color, and we see this a lot in the early national period, who are being held in servitude, and the person who's holding them in servitude will claim that they're slaves. And so, in order to gain legal freedom and separate themselves from these people who are making claims on their bodies and labor, they will go to court and sue that individual, and they'll have a lawyer. Sometimes they're supported with through anti-slavery organizations. Sometimes they're not. And they're able to, secure liberty for themselves and often their family members as well, without the ability to testify against the people who are holding them. One way I think that is clear through the evidence that I find that they can do that as well is the complaint itself. The legal complaint that's filed has their voice in it, even though they're not, directly testifying in court saying what their case is, or making their accusations directly in the courthouse through their own mouth. So
Interesting. Thanks. I was wondering if we could back up a little bit, because we're talking about specific laws and specific instances of free people of color operating within these systems. But I wondered if we could talk more broadly about, I guess we can call it the white supremacy project, and the way that laws were used as a system to erode the liberties of free people of color. What were the goals? Like, if we set aside the incidentals, what did white legislatures hope to accomplish by creating this constellation of laws, and how did that ultimately work out?
yeah, I think they're trying to accomplish different things depending on who they are. I think that's what I'm trying. That's what I'm trying to lay out in the book. That may be a little bit different than what other people have done before. Is that I see attacks on free people of color and the process of making restrictions as a process that is put together by coalitions of people who have maybe divergent goals, but they are they're brought together on certain issues, and attacking free people of color in certain contexts is a way of doing that. So for instance, maybe a good example of that would be restrictions on free people of color selling liquor, right? So there are clearly people who don't want free people of color around. They want all white nation. So that would be something that would be attractive to them. But there are also people who are pro-slavery, and they see free people of color as liquor dealers who will sell liquor to their slaves and get their slaves drunk. And they are against the presence of free people of color in general and in the liquor market in particular because of that. But then you also have white people who sell liquor who are interested because they want a monopoly on the ability to sell liquor. So all of these different interests come together to ultimately strip away the right of free people of color to sell liquor. Or if we think about voting rights, we see a similar situation taking place where you've got some people who are white supremacists and they don't believe that free people of color or any people of color should have the right to vote. That's their stand. But then you also have people who they may feel that way, they may not, but their primary interest is about creating a voting bloc that will support them. And so we see this in the early 19th century in particular with the Jeffersonian Republican Party in the South and also in the North as well, where they will attack the voting rights of free people of color. They'll say they're corrupt, or they'll even use white supremacist appeals to get support for what they're trying to do. But their ultimate goal is to defeat the Federalist Party. And because they see the Federalist Party as being supported by free people of color. And so what they'll say is, hey, you know, these free men of color can vote, but all white men can't vote. This is terrible. We're going to let all white men vote and take away the right to vote from free people of color. So they're offering to expand the franchise to some people who they believe will support them at the same time that they're trying to deny the vote to another group of people. So, you know, there are multiple things going on in that situation. And so, I think that in every case that a law in which a law is passed, you're going to have that type of coalition building in which people with slightly different interests will come together to take away the rights of free people of color.
I'm glad you brought up voting. That's something that we've been thinking about quite a bit. I wonder, I guess my questioning in some ways has focused on individuals underneath, working within this sort of legal and regulatory regime. And I wonder, thinking about institutions that were created by free people of color, and maybe starting with family. Maybe if we could talk, or if you could talk a little bit about the way that manumission laws and maybe the apprentice system were used to impact the way that families could exist.
Yeah. So as far as manumission laws and the apprenticeship laws, they do have wide effects on families, especially poor families. So throughout the book, I discuss how apprenticeship in certain ways was beneficial to free people of color. It could be an avenue to gaining a trade, learning how to read and write, depending on the time period. But also for poor women in particular with children, the apprenticeship system could be a problem because courts would take away children from their mothers or take away the mother's right to the children. And that could cause sometimes physical breakup of the family, but it also created generations of poverty for families because mothers were not able to access the labor of their children for their own benefit. Instead, that labor is going to a quote unquote master, and that individual ultimately will gain because the people who have been indentured or apprenticed to that master are doing labor on that master's behalf. And as far as manumission is concerned, manumission is both a positive and also a challenge, I think, for free people of color, depending on the context. So throughout most of the period that I'm discussing, with a few exceptions, there are restrictions on manumission. So this is a process in which enslaved people can become free. And so some people are trying to free themselves. So they'll save money or negotiate with the person who's holding them in slavery in order to become free, or they're maybe living with somebody who is had a religious change or something like that, and therefore is willing to free that person. But then the person who's been now freed has to figure out how to free family members. And so, under certain laws, you can easily go about buying your family members from the people who hold them in slavery. If you can get a job or have a trade where you can make enough money to buy them, you can do that. But by the early 19th century, and also, like I said, in the colonial period, because there's like, to make me clarify this, there's a space of time around the American Revolution, late 18th century, where most manumission laws are liberalized. So the major restrictions on manumission laws during this time period have to do with age. So states don't want old enslaved people being freed and thrown out on the street, basically, and becoming charges to counties and having to live in poorhouses. So they do put some restrictions on free people of color who are older, or enslaved people who are older, who may not be able to take care of themselves. You need to be able to demonstrate that you can take care of yourself, or you have somebody who can take care of you. So that's the more liberal period. But after that and before that, there are a lot of other restrictions having to do with the person who's being freed having to either have done something what they would call meritorious to deserve freedom. You've got to basically prove that you've done something worthwhile. And so sometimes those laws are interpreted very liberally, but sometimes they're not. And so people who are trying to get free are unable to get free because they haven't done something that's considered important enough by a local court or a state legislature. And so that can cause problems for people who are trying to bring their families together, especially if you have children, because children often haven't done anything that's considered meritorious. Also, another challenge, I think, to add on to the process of manumission and families trying to reunite, of course, is just cost. It's extremely expensive to buy another person in the context in which we're talking about. And if you can't get a loan, or you're not making a good bit of money through your trade, you can't just go and free all your family members, no matter how hard you work or how much you desire to do that. And even those people who are able to free family members often do it at great cost, and ultimately, they die pretty poor because they've spent all their money trying to liberate their children, or liberate a spouse, or a grandmother, or grandchild, or that's basically what's going on with manumission there. So it's tricky.
I guess in your last answer, you alluded to something that I found interesting. So your book, again, goes from the colonial period to the end of the Civil War, and you edge into Reconstruction. But when I think about that sort of arc, there is a group of events that you sort of selectively put in that maybe influence the lives of free people of color a little more than other. And I'm primarily thinking about revolutions, sort of politically violent rebellions. So you talk about what the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and of course the secession of the Southern states. And you allude to sort of the unevenness, the influence that it may have had around the revolution in terms of liberalizing manumission. Is there a way of talking about those revolutions so that we can understand their sort of broad impact on free people of color?
Yeah, so I think what I tried to do with all of those moments is provide a balanced assessment of what's going on. So I don't want to say that each of these events just completely changed the lives of free people of color, but at the same time, it changes the possibilities, not only for free people of color, but for people who are trying to limit their freedoms. And I think that's where I really go with a lot of these instances. So, yeah, the Haitian Revolution, for example, ends up bringing a lot of free people of color to the United States. People who are refugees from the revolution end up in New Orleans in particular, but also other port cities throughout the United States, like Baltimore and Charleston, Savannah, and even as far north as Philadelphia, New York. And so in that sense, you could maybe argue that that is a net positive for free people of color. Their population's increasing, and it definitely that movement has an impact on changing the societies of the cities in which these free people of color come. But then at the same time, we see that the 1790s and early 1800s is an opportunity for those people who want to restrict the movements of free people of color and restrict the growth of their population. The revolution gives them an opportunity to strike back, because now they can say, hey, look, this violent revolution against slavery is taking place in the Caribbean, and we don't want that coming here to the United States. So therefore, we don't need these people who are coming from the Caribbean coming to our states. And we also need to put some restrictions on the free people of color we already have in our community. So that's what I see in that particular instance. And then also to maybe talk about Nat Turner a little bit. The Nat Turner Rebellion is often cited as a moment of major change in the status of free people of color and people in the South in general. And I indeed think that the state legislatures use that moment to impose laws that probably wouldn't have passed otherwise. But at the same time, they don't completely get everything they want. And so I try to point that out too, that they have some victories, but they're not able to install the strict regime that they want to install. And it's something maybe to add to that is with all these laws that we've talked about throughout this conversation, they're often coming out of a context in which their advocates have been pushing for them many years in advance of them actually being made into law. And so that's really important for us to think about, because sometimes in the past, these laws have been written about as if they are purely a product of the specific time in which they're passed. And I'm trying to show that that's not exactly the case, but it's that the moment matters in the sense that it provides an opportunity in which political extremists otherwise would not be able to operate, because then they can build coalition with the pro-slavery faction. If you're a white supremacist, you can bring in the people who are scared, or they're worried about constituents who are scared. And so now they're willing to vote on this bill and make it into law, whereas maybe 2 months ago, they wouldn't have touched the bill. They're like, why do we need this? What's the point of this? I don't really care about this. It's not important. We have other things on the agenda that we need to pass besides these restrictions on free people of color. So yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to get at with many of these different moments.
Right. The changing possibilities. That's great. I guess I'm always a sucker for origin stories, and I was wondering if you could, now that we sort of laid out some of your thinking, talk about maybe the intellectual sort of origins of your work, because it's definitely a body of work that's moving in a direction, and whether or not, I mean, I've been around enough historians, there's often a personal project also involved in the research that we do. So if you could talk about that, please.
Yeah. So in my case, I think the personal drove me to the academic. Um, so I am a descendant of free people of color, and learned about that as a kid doing research on my own family. And so, in doing research on my own family, I started going to archives and discovering information about my relatives, but also about the people around them, the people they were connected to. And eventually, my search for my family expanded to this larger search to understand free people of color. And I started first focusing primarily on North Carolina and Virginia, which are the states where my relatives are from. And I ended up writing a undergraduate thesis on free people of color in North Carolina. So that's kind of my first academic dive into the topic. And that research continued on through graduate school. And I wrote my PhD dissertation on free people of color in North Carolina, which is the basis for my first academic book, North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, which came out with LSU last year. Um, and in the process of writing that book and working on the dissertation that came before, it seemed pretty clear to me that there was room for a larger project looking at free people of color in the South more broadly. And part of that was thinking about critiques of my own work, but also thinking about critiques of other people's work that I'd read. So my book was preceded by several local studies of free people of color, and they're often at the county or city level in the South. And the last study of free people of color in the larger region was published in the 1970s. So it was a bit dated, both in its interpretation, but it's just overall structure. And so, looking at all of those factors, I thought that this was a worthwhile project to take on. And so, I went with it, and now I have another book.
Um, I'm afraid this is the sort of librarian part of the show. I love your bibliography. I mean, your footnotes are just extraordinary. And I'm wondering if you could talk now a little bit about the sort of sources and methods that you've used to do your work. I think this is going to have broad applicability for many of our researchers. And the more I know about your process, well, the better it'll be for the work that I do.
Yeah, so and it's a very long and complicated process because I'm building off of work that basically, I started on what 15, 16 years ago in any serious way. So by doing research first on North Carolina and Virginia, I was able to build and figure out how to do research in other states. And a lot of what I found early on is that, there are records about free people of color scattered in places that you wouldn't think they would be. So for instance, when I think first started going to archives, um, I located records that were explicitly titled, often in free Negro records, or records about free people of color and enslaved people. Um, and so you would think, hey, I'm going to look at these records first. This is what I'm interested in. But I quickly learned, and I already had an inkling of this from other experiences as well, to know that free people of color appear in other places. So they are often in tax records, which we're thinking about like state archives. They're in tax records. They have wills because they're free people and they have property and they can give it away. They show up in, of course, criminal and civil records of the courts, and that those records can be loose papers sometimes they're volumes. And that type of research requires a closer understanding of the people living in any particular community define the free people of color. And I think looking back at what I found in, say, these records that I just listed off versus what you'll find in a collection specifically titled for free people of color or enslaved people, is that there are records that are missing, because anytime you're doing research on free people of color, you should go in assuming that free people of color are always not going to be designated as such. So many free people of color show up in records and it doesn't, say on the side, this is a free person of color or a free Negro or mulatto or person of color or whatever term is being used for those sets of records. And so that demonstrated to me that, you really have to understand the communities that you're looking at. And that would even carry over to records that I would maybe have found in at UNC, for instance. So I know when I was at UNC doing research, I looked at books that are basically like journals. They could be like medical journals where a doctor kept record of all the patients that in this context he saw. Or they might be records that belong to a merchant who is either selling goods to people in a community or hiring people to work on a farm or in a store or something like that. And in many cases, the free people of color in those records are not described as such. So you have to have a sense of who are the free families of color in a particular community to recognize them in those sources, and then to be able to incorporate them into a larger project like I did, and tell a story about, how, say, a white doctor depends on free people of color for business. You'll totally miss that story if you don't have all of that background information to read that ledger and understand, oh, some of these patients here are free people of color. So,
yeah. So you're using census records and just your broad notion of sociability in a geography, and then using that as a way of thinking about likely piles of papers that you could go to, and maybe you'll be lucky and people will be in there. But there's no external marker. There's no obvious mention that there are free people of color here, or
right. That's definitely the case in many situations. Not all of them. Some people are very diligent and discriminating between their different customers, but many are not. And so you got to figure that out sometimes. And I mean, as far as thinking about this strategically, because I had to be more strategic with this book on the South than, say, I was with my book on North Carolina, because I'm looking at such a large region. Of course, I'm going to spend more time looking at records that are connected to communities where there are free people of color in significant numbers. And then that way I can start to figure out, okay, these are the people who live in this community. These are some of the surnames of the families with large numbers of individuals within them. And then I can go and, take that ledger or take a diary and go through it and start to recognize, oh, okay, there's some free people of color in here. This is worth looking at more closely. Or if there's some type of guide that I can look at that the archive and the archivists have produced ahead of time, where maybe names are listed or there's some type of description of where this particular business was located, I can say, oh, well, this business was located in a community where there are lots of free people of color in a particular county. So this is worth looking at. And then you look and it's like, oh, wow, half of the customers here are free people of color, or a third of the customers are free people of color. So yeah, it takes some thinking and prior research to use some sources. They're not going to just come to you labeled, hey, this is about free people of color.
Right. Well, I guess that brings me to another sort of question. So we've been talking about sources and your methodology, but you've also been talking about what libraries do. And this is an ongoing conversation that we're having about sort of our behavior and the choices that we've made that have often, all too often, obscured people of color broadly. And I'm wondering if there are things that we have either done or that we could do that might help redress the difficulties that people have researching.
Yeah, that's a really tricky situation because I mean, I guess it would vary from archive to archive. Um, I think one thing, going back to something I mentioned earlier, so I know that in the past, in certain archives, there's been a move to, I'm talking about primarily state archives, group, say, legal documents into collections specifically about free people of color or enslaved people. And while I think it is helpful in some ways, I think it can cause people to miss a lot of information and others because the records have been taken out of context. And I've seen many cases where somebody has pulled, say, a court case, and they'll pull all the papers where an individual is described as a free Negro. But then there are parts of the same case that get left behind in another box because on that particular document related to the case, that individual wasn't considered a free person, wasn't labeled a free person of color or free Negro. And so you know, as a somebody like me as a researcher needs to go and check both sources. Whereas, you know, I mean, depending on how you're looking at it, you could have just checked one source by going through the whole entire collection, or probably in the worst case, what happens is that people are writing books or doing research papers or whatever, or creating whatever product, and they don't know to look at the larger, say, series of criminal related papers because they've looked at this collection called Free People of Color and Enslaved People. So the records have been basically segregated out. And while it's in some way easier to work with, it gives a very limited story of what's happening in a community, and and I think it could go even further with somebody misinterpreting the record if they're not thinking to look more broadly. You could come up with, you know, conclusions about how a court system works based on that small collection without having looked at the larger collection to know like what's really going on in that court. So that's something that definitely comes to mind, and it's something I've encountered and, you know, needed to think about.
Thank you. It's really helpful to hear from researchers that have delved deeply into these sorts of creative collections. I guess the last, because it looks like we only have a few more minutes, and I don't see any questions in there. In your conclusion, you talk about a number of I guess formerly free people of color who became really prominent politicians. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the legacy of free people. What happens when you make the jump after emancipation? What sort of advantages or debilities do free people of color have in that situation?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in many ways, free people of color and their descendants are able to um, have an advantage, at least over the formerly enslaved population during Reconstruction and after. And the level of advantage varies, I would say, from individual to individual or family, from family to family. So some free people of color in the pre-Civil War period are able to obtain educations. Some of them are actually pretty good educations for their time. And they're able to use that after the Civil War um, to gain political opportunities that otherwise probably wouldn't be available had they not received that education in the pre-Civil War period. So, for instance, if we're looking at lawmakers of color in the post-Civil War period, immediate post-Civil War period, free people of color are overrepresented among people of color in general. So that, says quite a bit. And there's some places where that overrepresentation is very extreme, especially when we think about the Deep South, where free people of color were very small population, but make up a significant portion of the lawmakers of color post-war. And then there are also, the free people of color who obtained land during the pre-Civil War period and were able to pass that down to their descendants. I know plenty of examples of families who have land that was passed down to them from their free ancestors. So those are a couple things that I discuss in the book, and I have some other insights that I think would be interesting for people to take a look at and think about.
Yeah. Well, Warren, it's been a joy. Thank you so much. This has been something approaching normal, and I've really enjoyed talking about your work. And I guess I'll go back to Monica, who can close us out.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Warren and Matt, thank you so much for such an insightful and wonderful conversation this afternoon. I want to say thanks also to my libraries and press colleagues, especially members of the Idea Council, Katie Fanfani and Sonia Bonchek, for everything they did to make this off-the-shelf event possible. Thanks to you all in the audience for joining us today. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy these books. Check out the promo code in the chat. The off-the-shelf series continues next month with a conversation with Dr. Samantha Rosenthal in their book, Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City. We hope